going to have to stay here for a minute. KJ's my food bank, buddy. Good evening. This is something I've been going to start on for a while, and it's going to take me a couple of Sunday nights or 3 to get through this. Because we see this more and more in our world today. People who think we need to keep the Sabbath, a lot of congregations, people who think we need to worship on Saturday instead of Sunday, and believe that God still mandates that. And we're not really Sabbath people, are we? I mean, we really don't understand what that means. We've never had to deal with that in our lives. It's not something that we're required to do or commanded to do. But I think it's something that we need to understand because it seems to be kind of a doctrine that's becoming more and more prevalent in our society. The Sabbath was an interesting concept in Judaism, something that was instituted from almost the beginning of time, from the time that God created the heavens and the earth. When he created the heavens on the earth, it says on the seventh day, God rested. But that really wasn't when he told us to keep that. You know, a lot of people like to go back to that, but we weren't commanded to keep the Sabbath until the law of Moses, till Moses brought the law down off Sinai. So even though sometimes we like to go all the way back to Genesis and say, oh, well, you know, it was in the beginning, it was before the Mosaic law. It really wasn't, because we weren't commanded to keep it until Moses brought the law down off of Sinai. So it's really a Mosaic law. It's not a patriarchal law, if that makes any sense. I really think you need to understand the significance of 7 in the Bible. 7's a number that's reoccurring throughout Scripture. Those of people who are interested in numerology or the study of numbers will tell you that 7 is a perfect number, right? 7 is a number of completeness, a number of perfection, and the number 7 comes up a lot of times within Scripture. But it's not until Exodus, it's not until the law of Moses that this comes down. And the command says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work. You or your son or your daughter, your male or your female servant, or your cattle or your sojourner who stays with you. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So Moses ties us all the way back into Genesis, into creation, but basically he brings up this idea of a 7th day of rest. Now I always thought it was really significant because the people who came out of Egypt were slaves, right? The Hebrew nation were all slaves. And I'm sure a day of rest to a slave was a unique idea. I'm sure slaves didn't get days off. And I'm sure they didn't work 40-hour weeks, right? And they probably didn't get Memorial Day and Labor Day, all that. So the idea of resting a day had to be really significant to slaves to say, okay, one day you're just not going to do anything. You're not going to do a thing. But it's more than that. And I think when we just limit it to just saying, okay, the 7th day, we really lose the significance of what God was trying to tell them in the Sabbath. So we kind of got to look at this. I'm just kind of laying some groundwork tonight. So this is in Leviticus 25. And if you read all of chapter 25 of Leviticus, you could probably get a better picture of this than what I'm putting on the screen tonight. But this is a different idea. This is 6 years and the ground lay fallow on the 7th. So this means that every 7th year, you didn't cultivate, till, harvest, or do anything to your land. You just let it lay. Now, it was more than that. You couldn't eat off of that land either. So on the 7th year, you couldn't harvest. When you depended on that to eat, people were like, and you really need read all of Leviticus 25 to understand this, but when you depended on that crop for your food, to say you can't have it, how are you going to do that? God's answer was, I'm going to bless you on the 6th year with 3 years. In other words, on the sixth, God, this took a lot of faith, but God in Leviticus 25, the end of 25, he promised them, he says, I'm going to bless your harvest in the 6th year so you'll have enough to carry you through 3 years, because you had to, on the 6th year you harvested, then on the 7th year you didn't do anything. Then on the 8th year, you would plant again, so it would be the end of the 8th year before you would have anything to eat again. So you had a significant amount of time in there. But in Leviticus 25, it says, speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land which I shall give you, then the land shall have a Sabbath to the Lord. 6 years you shall sow your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather in its crop. But during the 7th year, the land shall have a Sabbath rest, a Sabbath to the Lord. You shall not sow your field nor prune your vineyard. Your harvest aftergrowth you shall not reap, and your grapes of untrimmed vines you shall not gather. So see, you couldn't just not do it. You couldn't even gather what grew naturally, what transpired naturally. It said, the land you shall have a sabbatical year. All of you shall have the Sabbath products of the land for food. Yourself and your male and female slaves and your hired man, your foreigner resident, those who live as aliens with you. So the idea here is that now it's not just the 7th day, it's the 7th year. So now in the 7th year, you can't do anything. You just got to let it lay on the 7th year. Jews still do this today in the Holy Land, actually. It's still practiced by some Jews. Although, as with all Jewish things, there's legalities. So some Jews simply sell their land for $1 to their neighbor and let them do it for the year, and then they buy it back. So there's always a way out, right? Always a way out. It's interesting in Judaism. You know, Jews that own apartment buildings and rent houses on Passover, because on Passover you can't have any yeast in your houses or your dwellings. It has to all be cleaned out. And Orthodox Jews are very strict about that, and they go to great lengths to clean even their cars, to clean their house, to clean everything so that there's no yeast. But they can't clean out rent houses and apartment buildings because obviously they don't own them. So really Orthodox Jews will sell those apartment buildings and their other rent houses and stuff to other people for $1 for over Passover, so they actually don't own it. And technically, since they don't own it, it can't have anything in it. Very legality, right? This is very legalistic. Anyway, moving on. So in Leviticus 25, this is another thing. This is what we call the year of Jubilee. So on top of resting every 7th day and letting your land lie every 7th year, now every 50 years, you're supposed to have a year of Jubilee. You are also to count off 7 Sabbaths of years, which is 49 years, 7 times 7, so that you have the time of the 7th Sabbaths of years, namely 49 years. You shall then sound a ram's horn ahead on the 10th of the 7th month on the Day of Atonement, and you shall sound a horn all through your land. You shall thus consecrate the 50th year and proclaim a release through the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you, and each of you shall return to his own property, and each of you shall return to his family. You shall have the 50th year as a jubilee. You shall not sow, nor reap its aftergrowth, nor gather in from its untrimmed vines. So this is the year of Jubilee. And the year of Jubilee, if you study that, which the Jews, to my knowledge, never kept. I mean, maybe they did at some point, but I don't know that they ever actually kept it. But the year of Jubilee was very unique, because if I bought a piece of land off Roy, and then the year of Jubilee, I had to give it back. That's how it worked. So basically, if the way the Leviticus reads is that if I bought a piece of land on the 40th year, I basically would have to pay him what would happen in 9 years, because I was just buying those crops for that long, because all the land was supposed to go back to its original owner in the year of Jubilee. All debts were supposed to be forgiven in the year of Jubilee. All land was supposed to go back to the original owners in the year of Jubilee. And I've studied this, and I've looked at this, and I've tried, and as far as I can tell, I don't know that this ever actually happened throughout the entire history of Judaism. But God commanded it. I'm just not saying I don't know that they ever actually did it. It was a big deal. I mean, that's a big deal, isn't it? To have to give back to everybody, give them back their land, give them back their whatever. God wanted it. God didn't want them ever to lose that inheritance. That was the reason for this. But like I said, I don't know that it ever actually occurred. There's one time after they came back from Babylon that I think they tried to do this and might have did it to an extent, but I don't think it was ever done. And in modern Judaism, they say they no longer keep this because it's not valid unless all of Israel basically exists. And since Israel doesn't exist as a nation, technically, because northern Israel's been carried off, they say they no longer have to keep this. So they don't even try to do this anymore. But that was a year of Jubilee. And this is the end of it. For it is a Jubilee. It should be holy to you. You shall eat its crops out of the field. On this year of Jubilee, each of you shall return to his own property. If you make a sale, moreover, your friend, or buy from your friend's hand, you shall not wrong one another. Corresponding to the number of years after the Jubilee, you shall buy from your friend. He is to sell to you according to the number of years of crops. In proportion to the extent of the years, you shall increase its price. In proportion to the fewness of the years, you shall diminish its price. For it is a number of crops he is selling to you. In other words, God's saying you actually can never sell a piece of land. Basically, you're just selling the crops. You shall not wrong one another, but you shall fear your God, for I am the Lord your God. So if you read all of Leviticus, you'll get a bigger picture of this. But these three events, Sabbath, seventh day, land lay fallow, seventh year, and year of Jubilee were all part of this Sabbath event, all part of this event. So what happens? So Judah gets captured, Jerusalem gets destroyed, they get carried off to the Babylonians. Jeremiah said that God did that to them because they refused to keep the Sabbath. So they refused to keep these Sabbaths, basically. In 2 Chronicles 36, it says, those who had escaped from the sword he carried away to Babylon, and they were servants to him and to his sons until the rule of the kingdom of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths. Not just Sabbath, okay? You really need to get this. Not just Sabbath, but Sabbaths. In other words, it wasn't just because they weren't keeping Saturday. It was because they weren't keeping Saturday, they weren't keeping the seventh year, and they weren't keeping the year of Jubilee. He punished them by carrying them off to the land of Babylon. All the days was desolation. It kept Sabbath until 70 years were complete. So this goes into the 70 years of Babylonian, Persian captivity before they came back to Jerusalem. And 2 Chronicles and Jeremiah says it's because they did not keep the Sabbaths. So not just the Sabbath, not just the Saturday, but the Sabbaths, okay? All these things that have to deal with that. But moving to the New Testament, and I wanted to share these with you, and like I said, this is just kind of a groundwork tonight. I'm going to get more into this next Sunday night. But in the New Testament, Jesus healed 7 times on the Sabbath. I don't think that's an accident that we have 7 recorded healings on the Sabbath of Jesus, right? I mean, that doesn't seem like an accident to me, does it to you? 7 recorded healings on the Sabbath. The first one's in Mark 1:29 through 31, and it's the healing of Peter's mother-in-law. Immediately after they came out of the synagogue, that's why we know it was on the Sabbath, because they were in synagogue for worship. Immediately after they came out of the synagogue, they came out into the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Simon's mother-in-law was lying sick with a fever, and immediately they spoke to Jesus about her, and he came to her and raised her up, taking her by the hand, and the fever left her, and she waited on them. So the first healing, which is recorded in 3 Gospels, is the healing of Peter's mother-in-law. The second healing is in Capernaum. On the Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and began to teach. And they were amazed at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one having authority and not as the scribes. Just then there was a man in their synagogue with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, saying, "What business do we have with each other, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." And Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be quiet and come out of him." So the second healing was in Capernaum in the synagogue on the Sabbath when Jesus healed this man who was possessed. In Matthew 12, the third healing, departing from there, he went into their synagogue, and a man was there whose hand was withered. This is the man with a withered hand. And they questioned Jesus, saying, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" So that they might accuse him. And he said to them, what man is there among you who has a sheep, if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable then is a man than a sheep? So then it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. When he said to the man, stretch out your hand, he stretched it out, and it was restored to normal like the other. So this is the third healing. So you got Peter's mother-in-law, you've got the demonic in the synagogue, and you've got the man with the withered hand. It gets worse after this because they start criticizing him for healing. In John chapter 5, this is the man who was lame for 38 years. And Jesus said, get up, pick up your pallet and walk. And immediately the man became well and picked up his pallet and began to walk. Now it was a Sabbath on that day. So the Jews were saying to the man who was cured, it is the Sabbath, and it is not permissible for you to carry your pallet, not to heal, because Jesus had kind of already addressed that. It's lawful to do good. So the criticism here was the man carrying his pallet, which if you read the Old Testament, you weren't allowed to do that on the Sabbath. But he answered them, he who made me well was the one who said to me, pick up your pallet and walk. So the fourth case was picking up the pallet, the man that was lame for 38 years at the pool of Bethesda in John chapter 5. The fifth case is they brought to the Pharisees the man who was formerly blind. This is the blind man, John chapter 9, the man blind from birth. And it was the Sabbath on the day when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. And the Pharisees also were asking him again how he received his sight. And he said to them, he applied the clay to my eyes, and I washed and I see. Therefore, some of the Pharisees were saying, this man is not from God because he does not keep the Sabbath. But others were saying, how can a man who is a sinner perform such signs? And there was a division among them. So once again, Jesus healed on the Sabbath, man born blind from birth, and the question became, how can he do that? Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Is that a work or not? The question comes back up. In Luke 13, he was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath, and there was a woman who for 18 years had had a sickness caused by a spirit, and she was bent double and could not straighten up at all. And when Jesus saw her, he called her over and said to her, this is really an interesting healing because, number one, it's on the Sabbath, but number two, it's a woman, which is kind of fascinating in a lot of ways in that culture, that he would even recognize a woman on the Sabbath, that he would want to heal this woman. But he says, woman, you're free from your sickness. And he laid his hands on her, and immediately she was made erect again and began glorifying God. But the synagogue official, indignant, you start to see, as you go through these, you start to see how it becomes more and more of an issue. In the beginning, Peter's mother-in-law, nobody said anything, right? The man that had the spirit, nobody really said anything. But then eventually they start to bring this up, like, this is bad, you shouldn't be doing this. It became to be a question. It said, because Jesus healed on the Sabbath, began saying to the crowd in response, there are 6 days in which to work should be done. So come during them and get healed. And when I read this story, I always think part of this was because she was a woman. If you really kind of look, it says come during them and get healed. The idea is maybe she shouldn't even have been there, shouldn't even have been bothering Jesus, who they consider to be a rabbi or teacher. But then they said, and not on the Sabbath day. So that's the sixth instance. And then the seventh instance is when he went into the house of one of the leaders of the Pharisees. So now he's really pushing it, right? He's not in the synagogue. He's actually in the house of a synagogue leader, of a Pharisaical leader. He's on the Sabbath to eat bread, and they were watching him closely. You kind of see, if you kind of look at where I went through these, you can see how this escalates, right? From basically nobody said anything to now they're to the point they're trying to catch him, right? I mean, this has escalated. And it says, and there were in front of him a man suffering from dropsy. I do not know what dropsy is. I looked that up in the Greek, and the best I can come up with is edema, and I'm not 100% sure what that means. But according to the Greek, it's edema. He suffered with edema. So that's the best I can tell you about dropsy. When I was a kid, me and Susie was laughing about this before we come to church, because when we were kids and we got tired and didn't want to do anything, our parents would always say we were suffering from a case of the dropsy. But I don't think that's what this is. But he had the dropsy. And Jesus answered and spoke to the lawyers and Pharisees, saying, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? You can see how this has escalated, this debate, right? Can you heal on the Sabbath day? Can you not heal on the Sabbath day? Can you do good, not do good? But they kept silent, and he took hold of him and healed him and sent him away. And he said to them, which one of you will have a son or an ox fall into a well? Because if you go back into the law, they said, if your ox falls into a ditch, you can get it out. And so there used to be a joke when I was a kid, because when I was a kid, I was always kind of taught that Sunday was a Christian Sabbath. I mean, that's kind of what I was kind of taught. Not in the way, but it was always like, when I was a kid, it was like Sunday's a day of rest. No stores were open. You can't do anything on Sunday. You got to rest on Sunday. Of course, my mother didn't believe in rest, but, you got to take it easy on Sunday, right? And when we would go to do something, there always was kind of a joke, right? You pushed your ox in the ditch. In other words, you didn't have to go get your ox out because he fell in. You pushed him in so you could go do something. You pushed your ox in the ditch. Anyway, another story. But anyway, he said, had an ox fall into a well, will he not immediately pull him out on the Sabbath day? And they could make no reply to this. So I know I didn't really get into a lot of this, but I wanted to make you start to think about this Sabbath idea. What exactly is the Sabbath? What was Israel punished for? Should we keep the Sabbath? What does it mean to us, or what does it not mean to us? And why did Jesus push this so hard? I think that's a question we really have to answer. Why did Jesus push this? I mean, he could have not healed on the Sabbath. It's just like they told that lady, there's 6 days you can come get healed. Jesus didn't have to heal any of these people on the Sabbath day. He could have waited. He could have did it before the Sabbath. He could have did it after the Sabbath. Jesus purposefully did this on the Sabbath for a reason. There was something he was trying to convey to these people about this day. And so I think we have to address that a little bit. And I think, as we go through this, it's a question we really have to answer. Because like I said, it's a significant thing in our Christianity today. When I was a child, it was mostly just Seventh-day Adventists. But now we have a lot of people, even in this town, who believe Saturday is the correct day to worship, and that it's wrong for us to worship on Sunday. It's wrong for us to worship on the first day of the week. We should still be keeping or still worshiping on the Sabbath. So is that right? Is that not right? And, how do we make that determination? But I kind of wanted to give you a kind of an overview of what's going on here. Also, I thought it was fascinating to me that, and I never had numbered that till this week. I never had thought about that. And then I started wondering how many times Jesus healed on the Sabbath, and I came up with 7 times. And I'm just thinking, that's probably not an accident, right? He might have healed way more than that. We might not have it. But we have 7 recorded events. And I don't think it's an accident that we have 7 recorded events of Jesus healing on the 7th day. I just don't think that's an accident. So anyway, we're going to address this more. Thanks for your time this evening. If we can help you in any way, won't you let it be known